Jinoo hadn't seen his mother in weeks. He couldn't muster the strength to see her regardless of what anyone said. Since their mother had cancer, she'd been constantly in and out of the hospital. Mai kept herself busy playing with her plushies, while Jinoo's eyes were glued to the TV. On the screen was a commercial about depression, but the boy's mind was elsewhere, filled with worry, anxiety, and despair. First Dad, and now Mom. Where would we live? Who would love us? And why is all this happening? It's not fair, the boy thought. Jinoo wanted so badly for it all to be a terrible nightmare. One he could wake up from, with Mom there embracing and assuring him it was just a bad dream, and everything would be okay. But no matter how many times he closed his eyes, or cried himself to sleep, the boy always woke up alone and scared. As time went on, Jinoo became withdrawn and refused to see his mother. Seeing her in such a state was beyond heartbreaking, and was taking its toll on the boy. She'd lost so much weight due to not being able to eat. She looked like one of those Holocaust prisoners he'd seen in the books. The ones with the gaunt facial features, bony limbs, and protruding ribs. He was torn between being the little boy who still wanted his mother, and one who was ashamed of himself for wishing death upon her, if only to end her suffering. The pain of seeing his mother in agony day after day seemed like an eternity. He just wanted it to end. Please, God, make it stop. Don't you think Mom's had enough? What is it you ask of me? I'll do anything. That was the one-sided conversation he had with God every night as he cried himself to sleep. Cry as he might, the boy has yet to hear an answer from the Almighty. Since his father was killed in a car accident years prior, it has always been just the three of them. Their family didn't have much, but they were happy. Ever since Jinoo's mother became sick, she couldn't care for him and the 4-year-old Mai. Almost overnight, the boy became the caretaker for his mom and his sister at 12 years old. He felt alone and vulnerable. His mom always made him feel safe, embracing, and knowing exactly what to say at the right time. He thought back to the last time he spoke with his mother. Be strong, my brave child, she said, caressing his head as her tears spilled onto him while he clung to her with his head on her lap and was sobbing uncontrollably. He wanted to do as she said. Jinoo wanted to tell her, like she told him time and time again, that everything was going to be okay, but he couldn't. The boy was neither brave nor strong, and it shamed him. At that moment, a teenage boy entered the waiting room and made his way over to where the brother-sister duo were sitting. Compared to Jinoo, the boy was a few inches taller and appeared a bit older. He was fit and lean, with clothes on him outlining his frame perfectly, almost as if they were custom-fitted. He had a pair of black jeans, a black graphic-printed hoodie, topped off with a plain black flat-billed cap. On his feet were a pair of brand-new Jordan 1s. They were gray and black. The image on the boy's hooded sweatshirt was of a female anime character in a blood-spattered nightgown atop a set of steers. In her arm was a small zombie dog. There were some Japanese characters written at the bottom of the image in red, bold text. Hey, the boy called out, waking Jinoo from his daydream. Jinoo returned his greeting, but didn't recognize him. Looking up from his seat, Jinoo continued, studying the teen standing over him. He reminded Jinoo of one of those guys from the K-pop groups girls raved non-stop about at school. Though he didn't listen to the music, he did have to admit those guys looked really cool and fashionable. Do I know you from somewhere? Asked Jinoo. The boy's appearance intimidated him. Jinoo wasn't popular at school and didn't have many friends, let alone someone that was as well dressed. He couldn't help but think they were wanting some sort of entertainment at his expense, like a spectator at a circus, or worse yet, a ringleader to an animal, and a docile one at that. The boy was hardly a lion or a bear. His bullies were a constant reminder of it, which made him leery of others. You really don't remember me? The teen asked. He smiled as if amused by the whole ordeal. The teen removed the hood and cap, revealing the rest of his face. Unlike Jinoo, the teen had a light-skinned complexion. His shiny black hair was styled in an undercut fade with the longer portion at the top slicked back. He looked familiar, but Chinu couldn't tell where he'd seen that teen before. Then it finally dawned on him, after a moment. "Ty?" Chinu asked. "That's me," he replied, smiling. Chinu's face lit up, and he sprung out of his seat. For a second, all his problems were forgotten. The two laughed and shook hands. Ty brought him in for a hug. "I'm sorry about your mom," he said. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine, I guess," replied Chinu. He wasn't sure how to answer that. "Whatever you need, I'm here for you," Ty said. "Thanks. I'm glad you're here." "Of course." The two were next-door neighbors and best friends growing up, until Ty's family unexpectedly moved away. They weren't in the same grade since Ty was older, but he always looked out for the younger boy like a brother. Ty was charismatic and outgoing, so he was popular at school, while Chinu was quiet and awkward, with very few friends. They were catching up when his aunt and uncle came into the waiting room. "We're about to leave. Are you really not going to see your mom?" Aunt Nang asked. The boy didn't respond and only stared at the floor. "She really misses you," Uncle Nang added. Ty patted him on the back and said, "You should go. Come on, I'll go with you." Chinu nodded and reluctantly got up, taking Mai along. A few days later, Chinu's mother was discharged from the hospital and put on hospice, as there wasn't much the medical staff could do for her, especially since the last few rounds of chemotherapy wasn't as effective as they'd hope. Aunt Ning took time off work to care for the two children. Friends and relatives visited the family daily. Chinu had to return to school since he'd missed too many days already. It was something he dreaded, knowing he'd return to the torment awaiting him there. On the first day back at school that morning, a tall, fair-skinned boy with dirty blonde hair strolled in alongside three other boys. The tall blonde boy was Benedito, or Benny, as he liked to be called. He looked Caucasian, but was really Portuguese. Benny was the pack leader. Next was Anthony, a heavy-set black kid. The other boys were Moses and Diego. They were Puerto Rican. Upon seeing them, Chinu's breath caught in his throat, and a knot began to form as his heart hammered loudly in his chest. He watched as they made their way across the classroom and took their seats. If only I could turn invisible, he thought. Anthony spotted Chinu and pointed at him while mouthing something to the other boys. They turned toward the lone boy all at once, and Chinu gulped. A wide grin stretched across Benny's face as he walked over and sat atop the empty desk in front of Chinu, trying to be as imposing a figure as possible. He looked down at Chinu like a king on a throne did a peasant. "What up, Ching Chong?" Benny said, leaning over to get into Chinu's face. Chinu leaned back as far as he could, but the boy's cigarette-stenched breath was still brushing against his face. "What, you don't want to kiss me?" Benny asked, loud enough for the other boys to hear. "Don't you miss me?" Still grinning, he turned to see their reactions. They all laughed approvingly like a group of hyenas. "Where you been? We missed you. We've got a lot of catching up to do, you and I." The class was nearly full when the bell rang. Benny didn't say anything else except stared down the smaller boy, relishing every second as Chinu squirmed, turning his head in a lame attempt to avert Benny's gaze. The other kids saw but said nothing. "Benedito, get off that desk and return to your seat," their teacher, Mrs. Smith, shouted. Benny's glare didn't waver from Chinu even at the teacher's command. "The boys and I are going to throw you a welcome-back party," he whispered, climbing off the desk. Chinu managed to evade the bullies for most of that week. Unfortunately, his luck ran out. Benny and the gang caught him in the bathroom and jumped the poor boy, leaving him bruised and bloodied. He was so terrified of them he didn't dare say anything when the teachers questioned him about what happened regarding the cuts and bruises on his swollen face. The boy knew what Benny and his gang were capable of. He'd seen it many times before. The teachers nor the staff were not able to help those students, so he didn't think he would be any different. Uncle and Aunt Ning didn't know how else to help either. Like the teachers, Chinu told them nothing. Things went from bad to worse when his mother passed away that Saturday. That was the day a part of Chinu died. The boy was in such shock and distraught he barely registered any emotion, even when his aunt, uncle, and sister were crying as the transporters wheeled his mother's lifeless body into the van. Tai stood beside his quiet friend, who cradled a weeping Mai in his arms. "Mommy! I want to go, Mommy!" Mai shrieked as she twisted and turned, trying to break free of her brother's restraints. After the body was secured and the van doors closed, the transporters climbed into the vehicle and drove off. Chinu put down his squirming sister, and she ran after the vehicle. Before she could take more than 3 steps, Aunt Ning grabbed her. The little girl wept with all her heart and fought with all her strength, reaching out for her mother as the van got farther and farther away until she could no longer see it. Chinu just stood there, silent as a statue. He retreated to his room, leaving his aunt and uncle to console Mai. He shut the door and sat on the ground with his back leaning against his bed. Tai sat on the bed beside his friend. Has God finally decided to answer my prayers after all this time? He thought. Chinu almost wanted to laugh and tell him thanks. He curled himself into a ball, arms wrapped around his knees, and buried his face between them. A mix of emotion hit him like a semi-truck. The boy was relieved his mother was no longer suffering, but that wasn't good enough, so he let loose the tears he held back for the woman who had protected and loved him more than her own life. Chinu let out a long drawn-out heart-wrenching wail that sounded like a lost calf at sea calling for his mother. Tears streamed down the sides of his face and snot ran down from his nostrils, and his body convulsed violently from the uncontrollable sobs. It's better this way. She's no longer suffering, Tai said, patting Chinu on the shoulder. I know it's hard to accept it now, but you'll learn to do so in time. Several weeks went by after Chinu's mother was laid to rest. The boys started skipping school with Tai. They randomly wandered around and hung out. Aside from Tai smoking and drinking on occasions, there were no other drugs involved. Chinu enjoyed it because it made him forget about life whenever he was with his best friend. Chinu missed so much time the school called home and reported it. Once that happened, Chinu stopped for a few days only to start it up again. He became argumentative and defiant when confronted by his aunt and uncle about the issue. They finally got him to stop by threatening to send him to live with other relatives away from his sister. Despite his recent behavioral issues as he adjusted to life without his mother, Chinu really loved his sister and didn't want to lose the only family he had left. Not being able to skip school meant Chinu had to deal with Benny and his gang. They made Chinu's life a living hell. If they weren't physically beating him, they humiliated him, sometimes both. They also stole or broke his belongings. One time during gym class, the bullies cornered him and beat him to a pulp. Afterwards, they each laughed and urinated on the boy. The teachers, as well as his aunt and uncle, were deeply concerned about Chinu's well-being, but he didn't tell them anything. They changed classes, but the bullying continued. Uncle Ning finally had enough and took it upon himself to start the process of transferring the boy to another school, despite it being farther away. One day after class, Chinu stopped by the bridge where he and Tai used to hang out during the summers when they were younger. The duo would collect minnows near the shore or fished off the bridge. They played from sunrise until sunset and even slept at each other's house. Those were simpler times when both his mother and father were still alive, and he yearned to go back to when life wasn't so complicated. The boy sat by the edge of the bridge, his feet dangling off its sides as he stared at the water below, wondering if it was possible to press the reset button on life if he were to jump in. What's on your mind? Came a voice from behind Chinu. He glanced over his shoulder and saw Tai walking toward him, puffing on a cigarette. He took his seat next to Chinu. Nothing, replied Chinu. I hope it's nothing, Tai said, unconvinced. Tai exhaled a stream of smoke from his mouth, and they sat there in silence for a moment. Chinu continued staring down at the waves below. Heard you're changing schools, Tai finally said. Yeah, but it'll take some time for the paperwork to go through. Chinu wouldn't even look at him when he spoke. He was too ashamed of his busted face. Tai stared at his friend's bruised and swollen face, and it angered him. Though he didn't show it, Tai was boiling with rage. The poor kid was already dealing with the loss of his mother, and on top of that, those kids won't leave him alone. They've got to pay. I'll make them pay, Tai said to himself. The following week, at the beginning of class, Mrs. Smith announced Anthony had been involved in a serious accident and was in critical condition. The news shocked the entire class. Even the bully sympathizers were in tears. Chinu found it amusing. Benny and the others were a bit distraught upon hearing the news. Later that week, Moses and Diego didn't show up for class. Benny looked out of place without the rest of his gang, and a bit on edge, even jumpy at times. During a trip to the bathroom, Jinu was in the middle of washing his hands when he heard the swoosh of the bathroom door open and closed, but no one came in. Scared, the boy frantically wiped his hands on his pants as he started toward the exit, when Benny suddenly stepped in front of him. He had bags under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. His face was filled with malice intent. Jinu wanted to run, but his feet were stuck. His heart raced, and a huge lump formed in his throat. "What now, punk?" he shouted and shoved Jinu with all his might. The small boy fell, landing hard on the tiled floor. "Come on," Benny shouted. "You've been messing with us. Now it's payback for what you did to the others." Jinu was confused. What did Benny mean by that? I don't know what you're talking about," Jinu stuttered. "Bullshit!" Benny stepped in with a hard kick aimed at Chinu's head. He blocked it just in time as the blow struck his arm. He grimaced from the pain and scrambled away, but Benny continued his assault, punching, kicking, and stepping down on him. Most of it missed, hitting his arms, shoulders, and legs. Chinu backed into a wall and turtled into a sitting fetal position, covering his head and body with his skinny arms. The blows rained on him. They boomed and bounced off his head, limbs, and torso. He cried and winced as each attack sent shockwaves of pain through his scrawny frame. There was a loud clunk, then something smacked the floor. Surprised, Chinu looked up and saw Ty standing there. On the floor was Benny, laying there motionless with a huge gash above his brow, blood pouring from it and pooling around his head like a waterfall to a spring. What did you do?" exclaimed Chinu. "Saving your ass, that's what. Now move, we've got to get out of here," Ty yelled. The taller boy pulled him up, and the two ran out of the bathroom. What am I going to do? He might be dead," Chinu cried. They sprinted down the hall and turned the first corner. The teenager pressed him against the lockers. Look at me," he shouted, and smacked the crying boy. "Listen to me." Chinu was still crying, and it was starting to stress Ty out, so he got into the boy's face. "Stop crying. Listen to me. Are you listening?" Chinu nodded, but was still sobbing uncontrollably. I don't want to go to jail," he cried. "You're not going to go to jail. It was an accident. You understand? Do you understand?" The boy nodded. "Good. Now put this on and act normal." Ty took off his hoodie and slipped it over Chinu, then pulled the hood over his face. "You're gonna be fine. If anyone asks, just tell them it was an accident. You understand?" Yeah. Chinu finally started to get the crying under control. "You good?" Ty asked, placing his hands on Chinu's shoulders. "Yeah, I'm good," Chinu replied with a sniffle, wiping away his tears. "That's my boy," Ty said, giving him a warm, approving smile. "Get back to class. I'll see you soon." Later that day, Chinu was arrested and taken to the police station for questioning. Benny and Anthony eventually passed away from the injuries. Diego and Moses were found murdered at a park. According to private messages police found, the two were there to meet someone selling a pair of sneakers through a forum. There wasn't enough evidence to tie the deaths of the three bullies to anyone. They had a lot of enemies, so during the investigations, many kids came forward about the abuse they suffered. There were even reports of the gang meeting other kids through forums, pretending to buy something, then robbing them. While in the interrogation room, the detective played the footage from one of the school's security cameras. Chinu wondered when the school had the cameras installed, because they hadn't when he got jumped the first time. It was recorded from above. On the screen was him entering the bathroom, but there was something off. He couldn't figure out why he was wearing a hoodie in the video. Less than a minute later, Benny followed him into the restroom. The detective fast-forwarded through almost 5 minutes of the footage, then played it at normal speed. Chinu saw himself emerge from the bathroom, then ran toward the direction of the camera. The detective paused it there. The boy couldn't understand how he was wearing Ty's hoodie, the black one with the image of the anime girl holding the dog and standing on top of the staircase. It didn't make any sense. Why wasn't Ty in the video? "Recognize yourself?" the detective asked. "You should. You're still wearing that same sweater."